What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the terms are deep state. Oh dear.
investors,
Experts, diplomats.
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
Enjoy the
Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning, and if you listen to our first few episodes, then you know that over the last few months, my friend Justin Higgins and I and our friends have convened hundreds of live conversations, sometimes more than once per day, with up to 30,000 listeners and participants, where we hear live and direct from people in the news in their own voices, in their own words, in long form, and where anyone who wants to can join to ask them a question, share their thoughts, or just listen. We're just now starting to release recorded portions of our live conversations for the first time, and we're grateful to you for joining us. Today, we're excited to release part of a conversation, interview, and audience Q&A we had with Nicholas Kristof. Since 2001, he's written one of the most widely read and influential columns in the New York Times. He's also traveled to more than 140 countries, won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, and played a key role in bringing attention to injustices around the world, such as human trafficking. The free press plays an important role in our system. In many places around the world that don't have press freedom, people simply have no way to find out the truth about issues around them, and often that means the true activities and behavior of leaders, for example, stays in the dark. Throughout his career in journalism, Nicholas has covered an incredible array of the world's most important stories, raising public awareness in important ways. In addition to the issues I mentioned earlier, he's also covered the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Libya, and domestic policy issues such as education reform and consumer safety. We had him on at an interesting time. He's currently considering a run for governor in his home state of Oregon. An announcement one way or the other is expected any day now, and we talked openly about this, why he's thinking about getting into politics, what he hopes to accomplish, and what steps he's taken thus far. It was an incredible conversation with great audience questions, and we hope you enjoy it. As always, if you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find out more about how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, or hear past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live or pm101.club. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
So, Mr. Nicholas, you mentioned that you grew up in rural Oregon, and I kind of want to ask you about the experience growing up in rural Oregon and then moving and working for maybe some of the most elite East Coast institutions around, the New York Times. You went to Harvard University. How did these different experiences shape your worldview?
It was a little. I mean, I'd never been to Harvard before I arrived as a student, and it was just such a different world. But I feel really lucky that in my career I've been able to bridge different worlds and spend time on the family farm, which I treasure, but also to experience the greatness of Harvard, of Oxford University, of the New York Times, institutions that are just tremendous. And frankly, it was a little bit painful sometimes as a kid from the middle of nowhere to show up at Harvard and not really have any idea what I was doing. Our high school, didn't teach pre-calculus, let alone calculus, and a lot of my classmates were arriving with much better academic preparation. But I think I also learned a lot going to school in the middle of nowhere. So I feel very lucky that it all worked out.
And all work out it did. So this leads me into my next question, kind of about your experiences, because for everybody in the audience, you've traveled to, I want to say 140 different countries. You've written about events all over the world, some good, a lot really not good. I'm thinking Darfur, Tiananmen Square. But when you're covering these global topics, and now you turn your gaze to America, we have a divided country here at home. Do you see any patterns in the social divisions globally that are reflected in what we're seeing today in U.S. life?
Yeah, one of the reasons that I think it's so important that the U.S. try to address these divisions at home is in other countries, I've seen how divisions can get an awful lot worse and not only impede a country's economic development, but break out into violence. I've covered too many civil wars. I don't want to cover a civil war in this country. And, that I'm sure that sounds hyperbolic to some people, but I have friends here in rural Oregon who literally talk about, taking their guns and joining a revolution. And, of course, we saw what happened on January 6th. We saw how some folks in Michigan wanted to kidnap Governor Whitmer. The degree of polarization and distrust and the way people live in cocoons and rely on just very dubious information that is impervious to outside influences. I find that incredibly troubling. And I think it has to be a national priority to try to leach some of these poisons out of the system.
And I guess talking about maybe a different set of poisons in the system, I'm going to ask you how we can reconcile these two facts. Now that the white working class, and you've written about drug addiction, you've written about meth and opioid addiction, but now that it's facing white people, it's being recognized as a national health crisis. Many people don't know my father actually succumbed to drug addiction, and I come from a white working class family. But people are treated with empathy now because it's a white kind of person problem. However, there's been similar issues of addiction plaguing Black communities that were just exploited by our political leaders for gain and being treated as a crime without any type of empathy. Is it a problem that our national discourse shows sympathy for white people and not Black people facing similar circumstances? And I'm assuming you agree it is. How do we go about fixing that?
So, there's no question that there's a double standard and that there is hypocrisy involved. And when it was African Americans who were dying from addictions, we framed things in terms of junkies and needing to lock people up and throw away the key. And now that it's a lot of white people dying, then we talked about the need to have more treatment and find new models for addiction. And, so obviously this is a double standard. It's clearly hypocritical. Yet, on the other hand, I think it does belatedly lead to more humane, compassionate, and effective approaches to deal with addictions. So in ways that may ultimately benefit Americans of every complexion. And so I think it's unfortunate that it takes this happening to white Americans to develop more effective policies, but I think that may finally be the result.
Can you get into why you're planning or looking or thinking about running for governor and how you'd approach maybe governing for everybody, even if it isn't necessarily the most politically popular thing out there?
Sure. And you mentioned that Oregon is a pretty white state. It's a pretty white state, not just by accident, but because Oregon specifically banned people of color here for many, many decades. And even I'm married to a Chinese American, to Cheryl Wudun. That marriage was illegal in Oregon into the 1950s. The state has a deeply racist history that we in the state need to confront. So in terms of why I'm contemplating this crazy idea of running for governor in Oregon, look, I love my job as a New York Times columnist. I love the toolkit that I have to try to address social problems. But I've been running around the world trying to highlight humanitarian crises in Darfur, in Ethiopia, in Bangladesh and Myanmar. And meanwhile, there's been a humanitarian crisis unfolding here in my home state. And a third of the kids on my old school bus are now dead from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. I was not there for them. Oregon has gone downhill in terms of education standards, so that according to the Annie E. Casey Foundation, Oregon now ranks one behind Mississippi in educational outcomes, and that just breaks my heart. We have a huge homelessness problem. I had a homeless friend who died last December, and so what I have to figure out is whether I should spend less time covering humanitarian crises in Myanmar and more trying to address the crisis here, and whether I should put down my journalistic toolkit and try to pick up a political one. And that's what I'm, trying to wrestle with right now, Justin. And about 2 weeks ago, a 15-year-old girl here, a neighbor, died after taking fake oxycodone pills. And I think about that, and I think about a lot of the unfulfilled potential around here. And, that makes me think that maybe it's worth trying this effort that is is difficult and challenging, and yet I think a lot is at stake here in Oregon.
On that note, Mr. Kristof, what goes into making this decision? You just outlined the crises, the scourge of drug addiction that needs empathy and treatment as one of the main reasons that's driving you to run. But I'm thinking, take off the journalist hat, put on the political hat, come into my realm. How much influence does your initial fundraising or outreach to large donors play in this? How much does any type of initial internal polling play into this? What are the political realities, and how do you meld those realities with a desire to do well for your state?
Sure. So in trying to decide whether to run for governor, I've essentially two threshold questions. One is, do I have some realistic chance of winning? There's no point in leaving a job I love to run if it's clear that I'm going to lose. And the second is, if I were to actually win, if everything were to go right, then would I be able to make a difference on issues I care very deeply about? And so I've been talking to people about these issues, and it does seem that while it's going to be an open race here in Oregon, there will be a bunch of folks running, but I think I do have a plausible chance of winning. And you mentioned fundraising. One of my strengths may be that I have a lot of social media followers. I have helped direct a lot of folks to contribute to charities that I believe in, that they believe in. I've raised $21 million in a little more than a year for a group of charities. And it's hard to know whether they would donate to a campaign. Maybe they would, but I may have some strengths in that regard. And then in terms of, can I make a difference? Look, don't tell anybody, but I clearly would arrive at this with some real weaknesses. I don't understand the legislative process in Oregon in a way that many other folks do. I don't know many of the legislators, many of the county commissioners around Oregon. And, that's, I think, unquestionably a weakness. On the other hand, I have some strengths. I know many, I know many of the people in the White House and the cabinet and Congress around the country, in foreign leaders who may be in a position to help Oregon. I have a bully pulpit and convening power that may be more important than mastery of the legislative process to help set an agenda, to create a vision for the future of the state and get Oregon back on track. And so, that's what I've been talking to people about. How do I assess my weaknesses and strengths in terms of their capacity to make a difference for this state that I love?
And before we get into your solutions, got a couple more questions. One more political one. When is the deadline? We haven't really seen too many people declare. We know Nikki Fried's running for governor in Florida. Campaigning now seems like a 4-year job instead of just a 2-year job. So are we talking deadline December? Are we talking sooner than that? Sounds like a lot of the factors that you're thinking about, support, fundraising, you check off the boxes, and I have to assume that you're confident. So what's the last thing holding you back, and when's that deadline coming up?
I think that I need to make a decision pretty soon. I've been sort of thinking that by around Labor Day, I have to, or shortly after Labor Day, I need to figure this out. So it'll be sometime in September, and it's not exactly a deadline, but I think I have to make a decision one way or another. And I've been doing a lot of listening and thinking about policies, but I've I've got to come off my perch and actually make a decision, Justin.
No, well, you're already beating a lot of politicians with actually not just pivoting away from the deadline question. So we do appreciate that, Mr. Kristof. So let's get into these policy solutions about changing people's lives, like you say you want to do, and like you're already doing through your work as a columnist and journalist. You've called for many times in your columns to increase social spending in the U.S. Why should that be part of the solution or a major focus of the solution? And let's say you're a governor, you want to call up Joe Biden on the phone, you want some federal funding to get into that beautiful state of Oregon. What are going to be your top 2 social safety net priorities?
So I'm in favor of social spending that works. And one of the differences from 20 years ago is that now we actually have pretty good evidence about what kinds of spending works and what doesn't. And, frankly, there was plenty that did not. But one bit of evidence is that early childhood interventions really help, really make a difference. I mentioned that a third of the kids on my old bus are now gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. The best time to address that is not when somebody is 40 or 14, but in the first few years of life. And so, there's a great program called Nurse Family Partnership that is maybe the single most evidence-based intervention to help young children, to help address these kinds of issues. And it's in 9 counties in Oregon. I would love to see it be in all 36 counties in Oregon. So early childhood would be one important bucket that I would want to invest in. And the other would be to, K through 12 education, and especially to make sure that every kid graduates from high school. There are only 2 states that have a lower high school graduation rate than Oregon right now, and it just breaks my heart. If you don't graduate from high school in 2021, you are cooked. Your children are probably cooked, and we should have an all-out effort to support these kids to get them through high school, and then hopefully, with a plan on from that to get a job, to continue their education, including in community colleges for a vocational degree, or either higher education, or maybe it's the military, but to have a plan beyond that.
Okay, so that's one end of closing the opportunity gap. I want to talk about now the other end, as it's really timely. As you know, you're tuned into DC. There are negotiations for the transportation bill, the budget reconciliation bill, and taxes. So on the other end of closing this income gap, the opportunity gap, trying to pay for some of these programs, there's debates on how high the Democrats should raise federal taxes on the wealthy, raise corporate taxes. Where do you fit in this debate?
So I think that we should, first of all, think of this in terms not of spending, but of investment. I mean, in cases where it really is a human capital investment. And so, for example, my area here, the farm that I'm speaking to you from, in the 1930s, nobody here had electrical power. And then the New Deal came along and it brought rural electrification. And that was an investment in the productive capacity of farms here and all across America and of the people here, and it allowed education to get much better. My old high school was built in 1935 through the New Deal, and it hired, as I recall, about 100 people. I think it was a very modest investment, but most of all, it was an investment in the kids in the area. And, I went to that high school. Kids in Yamhill are still going to that high school. And so I would just emphasize that a lot of these kinds of programs are not just spending for today, but should be thought of like infrastructure as investments in the long-term productive capacity of the country. And if you don't invest in kids, you end up spending years later on prisons. So, we obviously have to be concerned about taxation and not creating a backlash, not putting American corporations at a disadvantage compared to others. But I would put the accent on raising the money necessary to invest in Americans, and especially Americans who are in trouble. And the fact that just about every other modern country can have universal health care and can have universal pre-K. Other childhood interventions suggest to me that we have that capacity if we make it a priority.
Thank you for that. And I guess kind of a follow-up here would be, what do you think of President Biden's agenda and the priorities that are outlined? I know that a lot of them kind of hit on the early childhood care, and then on the other end, elder care, through the budget reconciliation, through the transportation bill. Does this legislation go far enough, and what's missing in it?
President Biden has been a pleasant surprise to me in terms of his domestic priorities and his willingness to create something like a modern New Deal, if it can get through Congress. And the single, policy that I think may be his greatest legacy, and yet I don't think has had adequate attention, is the refundable child tax credit, or in other countries it's called child allowances. And essentially it's a regular payment to each family with a young child. And the best indications are that this can eliminate about half of child poverty in America. I just, I think child poverty is a national shame. I think it's enormously costly to the country in the future. And here we have a plan that can greatly reduce it at a fairly modest cost. I think that will be a really important Biden legacy. And likewise, the idea of extending. I hope it'll get through Congress, extending national pre-K and then 2 years of free community college. I think that can be really transformational for opportunities for young people around the country. So I'm brooding for this to go. And climate change, obviously, addressing it seriously. I think all this really gives me hope.
I love the optimism, Uh, so thank you. As a refresher, we are talking with Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. Potentially, folks, in a week or two, we may know if he's running for governor of Oregon. Deadline or decision time, rather, is fast approaching. I got maybe one or two more questions, and then I'm going to kick it over to the audience. Nicholas, over the last I guess you could say probably 5 years now, we've seen a drastic decrease in trust in our institutions, kind of culminating with January 6th. As governor, let's say you run, let's say you win, what would be your focus on how to rebuild the trust in your state from those in Portland, maybe? But also, what advice would you give to the rest of the country and how to rebuild people's trusts in our political leaders and in our institutions?
That's something I've been thinking an awful lot about as I wonder whether to run for governor, because Oregon is bitterly divided, as the country is, and indeed about 3/4 of the state of Oregon by area is talking about seceding and joining Idaho because it's more conservative, because they feel neglected by the Portland metro area. And I think and hope that as a liberal from a conservative rural area, as a progressive who has a lot of, frankly, pro-Trump friends, that I may be in a somewhat better position to provide some healing in this state than some other people might be. I think that it's going to involve a lot of respectful listening to ideas that we disagree with. I mean, it's really painful to me right now to talk to people around here about things like vaccines, and I believe deeply that everybody should be double vaccinated. And I have friends who resist, and I just go back and forth. But I think that we have to listen, we have to engage. I think it's important for a governor to go out into red areas, to have town halls, to not give up on those parts of the state that would never vote for a Democrat. And I would also love to see some educational exchanges. So take some kids from a Portland school district and send them out for a month, if they obviously only if they want to somewhere in Eastern Oregon, and take some of those Eastern Oregon farm kids and send them to Portland for a month. And maybe in the process, we can build a few bridges here and there and just mitigate this poisonous hostility that is tearing apart the state and country.
I guess my last question for you is, you've been extremely influential as a columnist. We were talking about this before you got on stage. You wrote a column about Pornhub, and it's the most popular website on the internet, and you literally fundamentally changed the way that they do business in a very, very good way. I can't remember another time that one specific article has had such an impact on a massive, massive company like that. How do you weigh your ability to do good as a columnist versus as somebody who's a governor jumping into American politics at a very, very polarized time, and potentially, if you run and maybe you don't win, or you run and you serve out your term, will you be able to go back to being a columnist despite having kind of some partisanship now on your resume?
So, how do I weigh the impact of the journalistic toolbox versus the impact of a governor's toolbox? That's what I've been wrestling with, right now. And my toolbox has been incredibly effective at raising awareness of problems, from Darfur to human trafficking, maternal mortality, but it isn't always very effective at fixing problems. And one thing that attracts me toward the governor's office is that one can set an agenda and actually begin to make some real progress. And I've seen some other governors, in a sense, that's also something a governor can do in a way that a senator cannot. You actually have real responsibility for a particular area, and you can work to try to improve educational outcomes, for example. I, in thinking about that trade-off, one person who comes to mind is the governor of Oregon when I was a kid, Tom McCall. He was a former journalist who had not been in the legislature, and he helped create the modern environmental movement here. He passed the first bottle bill, the beach bill that preserved the beach. He helped clean up the Willamette River. And so in his case, it really worked. Will it work for me? I don't know. And there is the possibility that I would obviously lose. And, I don't know whether I would be able to then return. It's a risk. But I spent my journalistic career running toward gunfire in places like Darfur. And this feels a little bit the same.
Now it's time for the audience questions. I'm going to go to AB for the first question and then Aram for the second question.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks for having me. Nicholas, it's been a wonderful conversation. So I did a little background information. I'm from the state of Texas, and I'm not too familiar with Oregon, but I did some research, and it seems that Oregon has been pretty unique in its own way in terms of being a catalyst for a lot of firsts and leading the nation in a lot of different ways, both socially and through legislation, most recently with the decriminalization of hard drugs and cannabis and such. So if you were to win the governorship in your states or just in general moving forward with Oregon, what do you foresee your state being the first state to do in terms of this next stage of or this next era of politics? What do you see Oregon leading the nation in?
Great question. It's something I think about a lot because as you say, Oregon traditionally was kind of a policy laboratory for change. So I would love to see Oregon lead the way in effective drug treatment programs. I'd love to see us be the first state to have more or less universal high school graduation. We talk a lot about improving college access, and we need to. Obviously, we need more kids getting into college, but we still have around the country about 1 in 7 kids who doesn't graduate from high school. And I'd like to see Oregon. I think there are some ways we can get to pretty much universal high school graduation. I think we can be the first state in the country to more or less eliminate cervical cancer. There's no reason a woman should die of cervical cancer in the 21st century. On climate change, I think it's important not just to reduce carbon emissions, although that's important, but also to develop new technologies. And I think Oregon has the prospect to show 2 kinds of technologies that are commercially feasible that would be revolutionary. One is ocean waves to generate electricity, and the other is carbon capture, sequestration in basalt formations in eastern Oregon. And those won't be proven overnight, but if they can be developed and made cheaper and commercialized, then they would be enormously important to convince China and India to jump on the carbon reduction bandwagon on sustainable energy. So, I think that there is, again, a chance for a state to not just do a good job at home, but to really prove models that the rest of the country and the rest of the world can adopt. And I guess the last thing I'd put in that bucket is maybe some effort at helping bridge some of this polarization in the state. And that if we can figure out models to try to reduce the temperature, have people listen to each other a little bit more, exchanges within the state, maybe there's room for the U.S. for Oregon to teach the rest of the country a little bit on that line.
Thank you for that question, AB. Sounds like our guest is well traveled. On that note, we will go to Aram, and then after Aram, we will go to Olu.
Thanks, Justin, and thanks, Mr. Kristof, for being here. I've enjoyed reading your columns for a very long time, and I've really been informed by them. And given there's such a foreign policy angle, I'd love to ask you about Biden talking about ending the era of remaking countries, but instead I'm going to ask you about insurance because that's the way I'm going to go. So I'm in the West, also in California. I actually worked on a congressional campaign in California's 4th Congressional District, which is currently experiencing the Caldor Fire, which is ripping up Interstate 50 and threatening Tahoe after already having burned a lot of structures and really destroyed a lot of livelihoods. And one of the things that doesn't really get talked about is that getting fire insurance, flood insurance, is becoming harder and harder, more and more expensive. And pretty soon, in a lot of places, it's not going to be possible at all. A lot of these people who have now had their homes burned saw their rates triple in recent years, and it makes a lot of sense that they did triple. And those increase in rates, sort of are borne out by the fact that a lot of places have just burned down. And I know in Oregon, you're facing a lot of the same kind of, human-caused climate change impacts of drought and fire. And I'm wondering, if you're coming into this particular moment of Oregon's history and becoming governor, how do you see addressing that, particularly that you're coming from rural Oregon where those impacts, I think, are probably experienced most directly? Anyway, thanks for being here.
Yeah, great question, Aram. So, that if I were a politician, I probably wouldn't quite say this, but I mean, the truth is that insurance rates do need to rise. And, there's been, flood insurance in particular has been really irrational. And there are people who live in a floodplain and get federally backed flood insurance, and they get flooded and then rebuild their home, and then it's flooded again, and they rebuild their home. And, I remember reading about a home that's happened to 7 times, and that's just not economically rational. Fire insurance has been more rational, but as you say, now premiums are soaring, and that's a huge issue for a lot of families. I think that what we need to do there is put a real emphasis on things that families can do to reduce the risk of fire burning down the house. And so give them reductions if they remove trees and foliage near their homes, if they provide a water tank that can help douse the area, and also raise rates for newly constructed homes, while trying to keep the increases moderated for those people who have existing homes and are trying to keep those homes and are doing what they can to reduce the fire risk in the area. But that is going to be you're absolutely right that this is a really difficult problem, and we don't want to subsidize risky behaviors in terms of fires, but we also don't want to leave people without insurance. I think we can also do more to reduce the risk of catastrophic forest fires, and I think we have to do that with forest treatment, and it would probably pay for itself, both in terms of reducing the consequences of fires and also reducing carbon emissions.
Thank you for that question, Aram. We will go to Olu and then Victoria next.
Thank you for giving me the chance. Mr. Nicholas here, I really enjoy your work. I've read extensively your work on New York Times. I really appreciate what you're doing out there. You're very diverse. You're very diverse in what you've done.
Thank you.
That's very good for the world. I just want to ask this question because I believe one of the things that have really caused, these COVID issues, get vaccine, don't get vaccine, and the issues around it has been about messaging, right? The messaging, that is coming from the top has not been right? Not been very consistent to really help the people. So my concern, my question to you is, where do you think that messaging went wrong, and how can we possibly, retrace our steps and try to give a better messaging to better assist people in the fight, of these COVID issues, and how we can get back to norm, and how we can put trust back into the system. Is that clear enough?
Yeah. It's a good question. I think what things went wrong early in the pandemic, at both ends, and part of that I think was President Trump downplaying the virus so that it became very politicized early on. And also, meanwhile, it's fair to say that the public health authorities, including the CDC and Dr. Fauci, that they that they downplayed the benefits of masks, and that was partly because they had a very legitimate, understandable concern that private citizens were going to grab up all the masks and not leave enough for healthcare providers. I mean, I understand why they were saying the things they were, but I think that left a belief in many parties that the public health authorities are changing their mind, that they're not reliable, that even they don't think masks are so important. And, then things have steadily become more politicized. And, so much of America, we're on teams. And so you get your cues not from scientists, but from what your teammates do. And I think that there's been quite a bit of social science work on how to get people to vaccinate their kids. This is all predating COVID. And, the evidence suggests that it's not about wagging your finger at people and not about telling them that they're idiots. It's about listening and gently pushing back and turning to people whom they rely on for ideas and beliefs. And it's kind of a gentle process. And I think that in America right now, we don't have a lot of gentle persuasion anywhere along the line. But I think we can do better. Some states have done better than others. And anything we can do to lower the temperature, to complexify issues, which makes them less ideological, I think can help. And we're not going to get it perfectly, but if we can make some progress, that will save lives.
Yeah, the mask thing was very frustrating. So we are going to go to Victoria and then Nahi.
Hi, Justin, and hi, Mr. Kristof. This is Victoria. I just want to say first, you are my hero, Nick, and you have been for a long time. I think you're the best thing to come out of Oregon.
Oh, thank you.
I am from Oregon. I grew up in Tillamook. So regarding the political divide, my family is quite divided, and 3 of us are liberals, and we are shunned like, last year's garbage. How do you think you will be able to connect with people that you're not even related to, who will shun their own children over leftist beliefs?
So, good question. I don't think that I'm going to change people's minds so much. I think that I can reduce the temperature a little bit. Yesterday I went on a walk in Yamhill with an old friend who, he supports President Trump. Has an extraordinarily different worldview than mine. And my goal wasn't to change his beliefs, but to keep a line open. And that's what I do here in Yamhill. And I think that we can do a better job of that in the state. I think that it's important for a governor to hold town halls in counties where there really aren't Democratic voters, not to win votes, but again, to try to build a little bit of civility. I was going to say build a little bit of trust, but trust is a pretty big word, but at least to just reduce the sense of hatred and neglect and antagonism. And so I guess what I'd say is that my expectations are kind of modest, and I don't think we're all going to be sitting around singing Kumbaya, but if we can make some progress in building a little bit of respect and getting people to listen to each other just a bit on as we talk about everything from vaccines to education, then I think that that could be really helpful. And I would love to see that happen. I have seen progress on some social issues. I've worked a lot with social conservatives on some issues that we all care about, and it's such a difficult, painful process sometimes. But when you get a bigger coalition, it's easier to bring about change, and that's the tension that I think we all need to wrestle with.
We're going to go to Nahid next, and then we'll go to Shane.
Thank you, Justin, for this wonderful room. And Mr. Kristof, I'm one of your biggest fans. I actually encourage my students to read some of your articles, including your article on Pornhub. So thank you for everything that you have done and your very diverse work. You mentioned a couple of points which really, those are extremely important to me. I work in addiction medicine as a mental health clinician. And what I have seen in addiction medicine and in trauma is that trauma is very intergenerational, and so is addiction, especially addiction. Not only it's intergenerational, but it's also highly, highly genetic. And what you mentioned about early childhood education and those early interventions, I mean, I would really hope that you can actually implement that, because that's where we will see the change and a break into those cycles of addiction and cycle of trauma in certain communities. I think my question for you is, what are some of your thoughts and plans as far as, those early interventions, especially when it comes to addiction inside the schools, especially in those areas that are highly impacted by trauma and addiction? Thank you.
Thank you, Nahid, for the question, and thank you for your work in these areas. It's it's a difficult area of work, partly because people relapse more than we would like. So I guess what I would emphasize is not just trying to break that cycle in the school system. I think it has to begin, way before the kid reaches kindergarten. And nationally, about 2% of kids are born in the U.S. with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and or fetal alcohol effects, and those kids arrive with facing an uphill struggle and more prone to substance abuse later on. In states like West Virginia, it's about 20% of kids that arrive with drugs or alcohol in their system. And we have programs that do work with at-risk moms and help reduce the abuse of drugs and alcohol during pregnancy. And I think we should, do more with those programs and make them more available. I think they're just a great investment with a high return. Then in early childhood, again, we have more than 500,000 kids in the U.S. who suffer from lead poisoning each year. That should not happen in the 21st century. Those infants who are exposed to lead, they're more likely to drop out. They're going to suffer educational failure. They're more likely to have contact with the criminal justice system. And it's just profoundly unfair that we don't do more to try to reduce lead exposures. Dealing with you mentioned trauma. And again, this is hard, but we do have some programs, home visiting programs that that work to reduce some of these traumas that children encounter. And I mentioned a third of the kids on my old school bus are now dead from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. If there had been effective home visiting programs that had sent social workers to those homes, tried to reduce domestic violence, tried to reduce child abuse, sometimes sexual abuse, then I think some of those kids would be alive right now. I would love to see an all-out effort to try to reduce some of the trauma that kids go through.
I wanted to go to Shane and then our fearless moderator up on right now, Nick, John.
Thank you, Justin. And thank you, Nicholas, for all your work helping make the world a better place. I'm based in Berkeley, California on Telegraph Avenue. And I've been involved in local politics and have seen how toxic it can get from the local level to the federal level. well as even geopolitical. And so my question for you is, what is something in your state that everyone loves and that can help keep the peace when it might get additionally toxic among the candidates?
I think that in Oregon, I'm not sure if this goes to your question, but in Oregon, I think we're all really proud of our outdoors and the environmental legacy that we have inherited. And I think there is, a genuine agreement that this is something we all take pride on, whatever our politics, and that we all should try to preserve. And there are real disagreements about how to do that optimally. But I think that is a shared concern that we can work with, and I guess more broadly, not just in Oregon but around the country. There's a real shared understanding that we can do more to provide opportunity for kids who are struggling, and I wonder whether liberals like myself should use words like equality less and words like opportunity more where they are substitutable. And I say that because I think that conservatives often hear equality and think that means equality of outcomes, whereas opportunity as a starting point, opportunity for young kids, making sure everybody is at the starting line, I think is very much a shared value. I saw one poll that 97% of Americans agree that kids should have similar opportunities at the start of life, which right now they clearly don't. 97%. 97% of Americans don't believe the world is round. So if we have that kind of agreement that as you say, it's toxic, it's difficult, but it provides some framework for trying to move forward on some of these really difficult issues in terms of improving opportunity for kids who are struggling.
Thank you for that question. We will go to Mr. John Gunnison. John, over to you.
Thank you very much, Justin, and thank you, Nicholas. As we've mentioned several times during the program today, you've done some invaluable work reporting on the conflict in the Darfur region of Sudan and the abuses and atrocities that were committed by Omar al-Bashir's government during his long period in power. As we know now, Sudan is in the middle of a transitional government, heading towards perhaps a nascent democracy, or certainly in a different direction that they'd been headed under Omar al-Bashir. So my question for you, Nicholas, is I am just very keen to hear your thoughts about the status of the transition. How optimistic are you? What challenges do you see remaining? And where do you think we are right now in the trajectory of Sudan?
Sudan is, it's so exciting what has been happening in Sudan in the last few years. And to see the people of Sudan rise up and throw out Bashir and risk their lives, and in some cases lose their lives because of their passion for better government, was just exciting, and I think that it really is making a difference. And Sudan is kind of on the cusp. There are still some bad guys in the government, but it has real potential. And I think we in the U.S. and other countries should very much support that change and transition. It looks as if Bashir may indeed end up at the criminal court on trial for genocide. And I just can't tell, having talked to, having witnessed that genocide, I made a dozen trips into Darfur, having seen, kids who were shot, having seen a man who was held down and his eyes gouged out with a bayonet because he belonged to the wrong ethnic group, having seen women who were not only gang raped because of the group they belonged to, but then marked with knives, left with scars to mark them as rape victims, to shame them and their communities forever. Boy, I want to see Bashir get justice. And I want that not only as a matter of what is right, but also to send a message to other dictators around the world that eventually this will catch up with you, and that there will be accountability at some point. You're not going to have impunity forever. And so I'm just thrilled by the direction, albeit too slowly, Sudan is going in. I guess, the other thing I would just say is that one of the lessons of my international reporting and state reporting, and it's, again, factoring into my decisions about whether to run for office, is that governance really matters. And that whether there's a good leader or a bad leader makes an enormous difference in the outcome of a town, a state, a country. And, you can argue that Sudan went through 2 or more genocides in South Sudan, and then in Darfur, and even in the Nuba Mountains as well. And that was because of a really bad leader. Governance and who steps up and is willing to compete for leadership, boy, that matters.
Yes, it does. John, thank you for that great positive question for the last one. Now, Mr. Kristof, we want to thank you, obviously, from the bottom of our hearts, offer you this platform whenever you want to be back, whether it's as a columnist or potential governor. But we always ask our guests here, you have nearly 1,000 people still in the audience. We've reached well over 6,000. What do you want to leave the people in the audience with? It can be optimistic, it could be pessimistic, it could be somewhere in between.
I guess I would leave people, really hoping that you will engage with some of these issues and work in your own way to try to address the well, I said earlier I didn't want to talk about inequality, but about opportunity. So to address that issue of whether you call it inequality or opportunity, but there are just too many kids who around the country, disproportionately kids of color, but frankly, kids of every ethnic and racial background who aren't getting a fair chance in life. And so, if you have resources, think about donating to a group that can make a difference. Otherwise, think about maybe you can volunteer with a group like Reading Partners to do some tutoring of a fourth grade kid who needs some help, or maybe it's Big Brothers Big Sisters, or maybe it's something international. But to try to engage in the world and chipping away a little bit at some of these inequities in ways that will help. Right now we're seeing Afghan refugees coming to the U.S. My dad was taken in by Oregon when he was an East European refugee in 1952, and it transformed. I'm here because of that, because there were some Oregonians who had compassion for him, and that didn't solve the global refugee crisis, but boy, it was transformational for us. And so here's your chance to change the world.
Thank you very much for that, Nicholas. I wish you the best of luck with your decision, and more importantly, I hope you and your family can have a great Labor Day weekend together.
Terrific. Thanks so much to you, Justin, and to everybody listening. It's been a real pleasure to engage with this platform for the first time.
Well, that's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Nicholas for coming out, to our audience for their great questions, and to you for being here. If you like or dislike what you hear, if you want to find past episodes, learn more about how to join us almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, please visit our website, pm101.club or pm101.live. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of our co-founder Justin Higgins and I and our team, thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.